Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this worldwide broadcast of the Kev Baker Show right here on Truth Frequency Radio, www.tfrlive.com. I want to thank everyone, as usual, for taking the time out to tune in today, and hopefully we will present you with a lot of information for your consideration. And after all of it, and I'm sure you might even need to take notes during this, myself, and I'm sure tonight's guest as well, would urge you to go and check everything that we are talking about. You know, that's something you should do anytime you listen to any show in the alternative media, mainstream media, any source. It doesn't matter how much you trust them. And as you all know here at TFR, I've been doing this a number of years on radio, but I've been doing it even longer over on the YouTube. And I was inspired back in the day, you know, post 9/11 by people like Alex Jones, David Icke, to pick up a microphone and be a replacement for this lying mainstream media that we were all starting to finally wake up to. And, you know, things were going really well. They were rolling on. And I was really optimistic. And I think a lot of people were out there, more and more people coming along. Shows springing up here, there, everywhere. Lots of different opinions to choose from. And that was a good thing. But then, after being told by, again, those two characters in particular, Alex Jones and David Icke, about the left-right paradigm, we were all getting to the point where we had woke up to what is really going on in the world of politics and how there's a hidden hand and an agenda behind everything we see and are told. And just when it started to look like we were gaining traction and getting somewhere to the point where we could replace that mainstream media, something really strange happened. And for me, it was around the time of maybe 2014, 2015, and in particular in the build-up to the 2016 election of Donald Trump. I watched one of the people I mentioned before, Alex Jones, go from convincing tens, possibly hundreds of thousands of people about the left-right paradigm and exposing all of that, to going full 180 opposite that and going all in and hitching his wagon to a particular party. Now, that was strange enough. And at the same time, we had an influx of all these new personalities, and something started to grow that we now know as the alt-right. So Donald Trump got in, and ever since then, and you know, ladies and gentlemen, I've been saying it, something very weird has happened to our truth movement, for lack of a better term. Be it infiltration, be it Psy-Ops, or as we're going to find out tonight, just downright liars. Something terrible has gone wrong. And last night I was talking about sheep in wolves' clothing, and I was even having a laugh about the deep state in MAGA hats. But you know what, folks? Deep state devils do wear MAGA. And to help me get into all of this tonight, I'm absolutely honoured to be joined by Lee Stranahan. Now, Lee is a pioneer in digital media who has over 25 years of experience in broadcast production, education, and independent media as a producer, director, and teacher. You can follow him over on Twitter at Stranahan. And Lee previously worked at Breitbart News and is currently a co-host on a show called Fault Lines that you can find over on Sputnik News. I urge you all to follow him over on Periscope as well to keep up with all of his latest updates. Because, as you know, in recent times, I have moved away from the political arena because of everything I just said in the introduction. But now and again, there's a character or two come along that really stand out from the rest. And they stand out because they're following the truth. And you know what? They don't care whose toes they stand on to get there. So Lee Stranahan, welcome to the show, sir.
Kev, thanks for having me. And B, I could not have asked for a better introduction. That was a phenomenal introduction. And the setup, and we hadn't really talked much. You and I had not talked. We talked a little before the show. but I could not have asked for a better introduction, and here's why. Some of the stuff I'm going to talk about directly relates to a number of things that you mentioned. So let me just talk about your intro for a second, mention a couple things there before we get into the questions, if I could. First off, you mentioned David Icke. If people have not seen, it's about a 10-minute presentation about the roundtable groups that Icke did in like the 1980s. It's on YouTube. I recommend anybody. That is the best 10-minute intro to the idea of understanding how these roundtable groups, the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, and so on work. Now, by the way, why is that important? We're going to be talking about Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein was a member of both the CFR and the Trilateral Commission. And when you look at these other groups, the Bilderberg groups, for instance, and then the Bohemian Grove thing, and you mentioned Alex Jones, the other thing I would urge people to look for, if they haven't seen it, they probably have, but it's the thing Alex Jones did a few decades ago about Bohemian Grove with John Ronson. That piece is important. Why is that important? We're going to talk about a guy soon who is behind this Psy-Op operation. It's an explicitly, and that's not me saying it, it's him saying it. We're going to talk about the millionaire whose great-grandfather was the president of the Bohemian Club in San Francisco, according to him. And this is the guy behind Mike Cernovich, Jack Posobiec. Nothing I'm saying is conjecture here, and we'll go through it. But mentioning Alex, especially because of that Bohemian Grove connection, you're going to see that if people understand how these roundtable groups work, how these elitists work, this Davos, ski at Davos, summer at Bohemian Grove group works, right? And it's real now. That's the other thing they're petrified of. 40 years ago, like you say, that was all, there's no such thing as skull and bones. That's just a myth. Now they've had to change the story because they're like, well, of course there's such a thing as skull and bones, but it's just a fraternity. Well, wait a second. Didn't you guys just say it didn't even exist? Ignore that. It's just really a fraternity. That's all it is. It's nothing for you to worry about. Forgive the phone there. But these elites are petrified now because, quite frankly, of the cell phone. Because now everything I'm saying, people will be able to research, and then we'll be able to communicate around the world, and that is petrifying. If you're these elites who run the world, whether it's monarchies or groups like the Rothschilds, for instance, who are connected to banking, but also to royalty, who show up time and again. It's not a myth, and that's going to come up with both Epstein, by the way, the Rothschild connection I've got for you too. But once you understand that this is real, and that's why the Icke presentation is so good and the Bohemian Grove thing, this is real. This is not conspiracy theory. It's not conjecture. And you hear some crazy stuff. I like stuff I can prove, but there's so much stuff you can prove here that you 100% go, yes, this is a real thing. There is a ceremony involving a big owl, and okay, that's kind of weird, but that's a fact. Now we know that thanks to Alex's work, that having that background makes the psyop that you're talking about, that you sensed in 2014 and 2015. I'm going to explain exactly what happened with names, dates, people behind it, and you'll see if people go look up the writings of the people themselves, they called it a psyop. This is exactly what they were doing, and they admit it. So it's, like I say, your intro could not have been greater, and forgive me for filibustering there, but I wanted to just emphasize some points you made without even knowing maybe that you were making them.
No, there's something really weird been going on, Lee, and like I say, as a veteran of this truth war, the information war that we're in, I think you start to get a kind of gut feeling about things, and I'm not sure if you want to take us back and start there, or if you would prefer to really get into what you're calling the biggest story of your career. And as I was saying to you before we came on air, this is quite a dangerous topic to be covering as well, sir, because the powerful people involved, it really is.
Yes.
And the way you've laid it out, especially over on Twitter and things, it's made it easy for people to follow where you're coming from, and you've documented it. I mean, this isn't just the wild claims that have become the done thing over on YouTube or Periscope, like we've become used to in recent times. People just making these huge claims, and we're expected to accept that without clicking the links and checking what they're talking about. So I thank you for that. And that's why I'm really pleased to have you on the show, because for the listeners out there, I'm not political in any way, Lee. I'm apolitical. I try to stay unbiased. But I know there's people out there who have really gone for Donald Trump, and absolutely brilliant that they're into that. But I'm scared that they're being misled and they're being used in this psyop. So I'll hand it over to you where you want to start from. I'm easy Ozy, sir. So you take it away.
Well, I think, and I know Alex Jones a little bit. I've been on a show a number of times, and I've hung out with him a little bit. And I believe that I know for a I got to confirm it with Alex, but I've heard by people very close to him. He doesn't know who this Jeff Giese I'm about to talk to is. Jeff Giese is the guy behind all of this stuff. So why don't we start with him? He's the name most people don't know. People may have heard of Mike Cernovich. People may have heard of Jack Posobiec. They've probably heard of Peter Thiel, right? But the event they may, but I'll tell you what else they definitely heard of. Milo Yiannopoulos, let's throw him in there. They probably heard of Milo. And they've certainly heard of this idea of memes, right? Like Pepe the Frog and stuff like that were coming up.
And we've definitely talked about Thiel on here because we've talked about his company Palantir. They're an interesting bunch as well. So yeah.
And Palantir shows. Let's start with. Why don't we start with Thiel? Because it's a good way to get into Giese because they're connected, right? So Peter Thiel is the billionaire who was one of the founders of PayPal. Now, in a number of people, including Elon Musk, for instance, were in that group of people behind PayPal who became billionaires, right? One guy who was in early on PayPal, his name's Jeff Giese. And Jeff's last name is spelled Giesea. And by the way, interestingly, for a guy whose resume I'm about to give you, he doesn't seem to have a Wikipedia page. I've not gone through exhaustively, but the brief research I did, I have found very little info on him, and I'm very good at research. By the way, let me just mention something on method here. I'm a research-based investigative reporter, but I also interview a lot of people. And a lot of the story that I'm getting is from people with direct knowledge of events. And it's from my knowledge, too, when I was at Breitbart, of things that I saw that I see in a different light now that didn't make sense. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But let's go to Thiel. He's one of those founders of PayPal. And Giese was actually could have been one of those founders, but he didn't believe in it, I hear. This is the story I've been told. And I reached out to Jeff for an interview, and I hope he gives me one. But he cashed out. So I've heard Jeff Giese is worth about $30 million. I don't know that to be true, but that's what I've been told by people close to him who've worked with him. And but he's a millionaire. He states that he's a millionaire. But Thiel's a billionaire, right? And so Giese's got the thing, but Peter Thiel, when he was at Stanford University, he edited something called the Stanford Review. And that's a big sort of conservative libertarian newspaper. And so they've always been controversial because they sort of go up against the leftist orthodoxy on campus, which, by the way, that's a position that I don't like that leftist politically correct orthodoxy either. So I like that opinion. I'm a libertarian, libertarian Republican, but I'm sympathetic to that position. And so for that and other reasons, I like Peter Thiel just broadly. And I was able to go Palantir. Well, that's kind of scary. And he did get all of that money from the CIA's Q Intel to start it. But I like the guy and blah, blah, blah. And so I admit that I was kind of like somewhat taken in. I was able to ignore glaring things like Palantir because I liked what he was saying. And hopefully people, I think, can identify with that, right? Where you go, I like the way this politician talks, and then you find out, oops, it's like, gee, this politician seems to be a feminist who cares about women, and that's why I like Bill Clinton or John Edwards or Anthony Weiner, and then you kind of get let down. And so, I get that. That happens. People fall for the words and not the actions, not the way the person is. So I was able to ignore Palantir. But the Giese connection is important because he was also an editor I think he went to school 10 years later than Thiel. Giese is class of 97. And he was the editor of the Stanford Review as well. And Thiel is still active, even though he's an alumni and not there anymore, with the Stanford Review. He donates, he helps people get connections. And as I say, Giese was part of that early PayPal thing. So these are guys who worked together for a long time, since Giese was at Stanford. Now Giese admitted that he's the one who said his great grandfather was the president of the Bohemian Club. And as you probably know, in 1972, Richard Nixon said, anybody can be president of the United States, but you got to be something special to be the president of Bohemian Club or something like that. He said, not everybody. I forget. I'm not quoting exactly.
That sounds about right.
What's that?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, no, it does sound about right. So this is one of those secret society. It's been called the Secret Society Summer Camp. And his great-grandfather was part of it. And when someone told me that, and I confirmed it in a speech he made at this thing called the Deplorable, it's up on a site called American Greatness. If you look for it, Giesea, Giesea, and then Bohemian Grove, you'll find it. And he said it himself, that his great-grandfather was there. But when someone told me that, I went to Jeff Giese's Twitter page, and right now, the end of July, which is when Bohemian Grove is, he's saying, this is where I'll be for the next week drinking coffee. And at Russian River, which is, now again, the Russian River, it may be long. Sure, he may not be there, but I told him on Twitter, I said, are you there? Are you at Bohemian Grove right now? Because it looks like you are. And I haven't heard back from him. But again, be it as it may, I'm not saying that that makes him instantly guilty of anything, but it's an interesting connection. And this is my point about Alex. Alex didn't know that. So I think if Alex knew that some things that happened may be different. Now, so why am I bringing him up? I brought up this guy, Connection Bohemian Grove. You can look at his Twitter page and see. Jeff Giese is the person behind Mike Cernovich, Jack Posobiec, and that entire meme army thing. Now, the term Jeff uses for it is memetics, memetic warfare, MEMETK, memetic, I wouldn't even want to spell it actually. Look up memetic warfare, and you'll find he's written, again, he's a guy who's like Stanford Review libertarian, right? But he's written papers for NATO Stratcom. It's in their journal back in 2015, talking about how the U.S. needs to invest in memetic warfare, okay? Now, one thing that Ike explains briefly in that video I mentioned about the roundtable groups is this method that a lot of these secret society groups like Skull and Bones use, which is they create, it's a Hegelian technique of, create a problem, create the opposition, then you control both sides, and then you provide the solution, right? So Giese, on one hand, is a libertarian. If you listen to, Republican libertarian, if you listen to his words at the Deplorable speech, if you're a libertarian, you'll go, I like this guy. This guy seems awesome. But then if you go read what he was writing in 2015 about memetic warfare, he's clearly trying to sell NATO as well as the U.S. military on this idea of memes are a way to fight a propaganda battle. And interestingly enough, one of the things that he talks about is exactly what Russia was accused of with the Facebook, the Facebook ad buying. Now, again, I'll point this up. I work for Russia. I host a show on Radio Sputnik. So let's not take my word for it. In a recent court decision, anyone can go look this up, the judge that was on the case where the U.S. government, Robert Mueller, was indicting this company that was the Russian troll farm, right? And the judge admonished Mueller and William Barr, stop saying that Russia, you guys are going out in public and saying Russia's behind the Facebook thing. You don't have any proof of that. You've shown the court no proof for that claim. Yet you keep going out on TV and saying it, and you need to stop it or I'm going to hold you in contempt. That's what he said. And don't take my word. It's the Concord ruling That's not me saying it, that's the judge. So when I say to you that there's no proof, according to the judge in the case, don't take my word for it. Now, the reason this is significant is Gysia was talking about that exact thing in 2015 before the election. He was saying the Russians are going to use memes and blah, blah, blah. In other words, now, am I saying that there's a connection there? I think there's a very interesting coincidence. And when you take it in with the other stuff that I know for sure he was doing, which was, and I'll give two examples. Jeff Gysia, as part of this meme war, had a private account on Twitter. And I have been told by somebody with direct knowledge of the situation, who I believe is telling the truth, that Jeff Gysia was personally running this Twitter account that was putting out racist and anti-Semitic memes from a Trump, like they're a Trump supporter. Now, why would you do that? And the reason might be to inflame the left. Let's think about this for a second. If I'm on the right and I'm a Trump supporter and I see some racist meme, and I myself am not racist, because by the way, I don't believe that most Trump supporters are racist. I don't fall for that either. But without getting into a big philosophical discussion about what is racism and blah, 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 they don't think that they're racist, right? They don't think that. And so I'm mystified, actually, why they keep calling me racist. But if you're on the left, and particularly the far left, and you see these Pepe the Frog, Trump hat wearing, throw Hillary in the gas chamber memes, you're like, these guys are Nazis. Look at this. And by the way, some of those memes were horrible and offensive. And what I'm telling you is a source with firsthand knowledge said Jeff Gysia's private account was putting those sorts of memes out. That is, and again, I can't say more now, but that is what I have been told, and I'm making the claim publicly. There you go. Now, what we know for sure, not a question in the world, because he admits it, is he was the guy behind this deplorable, where, by the way, a bunch of protesters showed up. And let me talk about some other reasons I think he may have been instigating things here. I had a conversation with Richard Spencer over the weekend. He asked me to do his podcast. I have a policy. If someone wants me to come on, you know, when you texted me, I just immediately said yes. I do what basically, if anyone wants to interview me, I say yeah. So particularly if it's a live interview. So I talked to Spencer. Now, Spencer is a well-known, white nationalist, and he's honest about who he is. That's who he is. He's white. He's a identitarian, he would say. But what I didn't know until the conversation with him, because I never knew it, is number one, Jeff Gysia paid his organization $5,000. Okay. That's a big deal, because this guy who's behind the deplorable, which was Mike Cernovich and Jack Posobiec, that guy paid Richard Spencer $5,000 to his organization and attended 3 meetings of the organization. Now, Spencer's take was that he was a dilettante. That's the word Spencer used with me. And by the way, I would really recommend people, if they want to, check out that conversation between Richard Spencer and I, because what was interesting is it wasn't a gotcha. We don't agree, obviously. I mean, I don't agree with a lot of the things Spencer believes, but what we discussed was, I, from a perspective of a guy who worked at Breitbart, and him from a perspective of a white supremacist who, I don't know that world. He told me stuff I never would have known, like he got the money and that Gysia attended these meetings. Now, since I started working on this story, person after person has contacted me and said basically like, oh my God, I'm so glad that Jeff Gysia, you're exposing him. You're exactly right. He's the person after person says, he's the guy behind this. He's the guy behind this. And you can look him up. Look up Jeff Gysia deplorable, and look up that event. Now, this was a big event right before the Trump inauguration. And nobody going to that event knew that in fact, when I say to people, who was behind that? They go, Mike Cernovich. Well, Jeff Gysia is the guy who is bankrolling Mike Cernovich. And this is where the story starts to morph into the Jeff Epstein story. This is where
Let's actually leave it there, Lee, because we're going for a 3-minute break in just a moment. So let people know where they can find your work before we head out to the break.
The best way right now is Stranahan on Twitter. I post links to a lot of my stuff there. So I have a website too. A good depopulist guy.
Welcome back, everyone. Second part of today's show with Lee Stranahan, and you can hear him over on Fault Lines on Sputnik News. Please check him out. I thoroughly enjoy Lee's work, and that's why I trust him enough to come on to the show tonight to talk about this topic that I have backed away from in recent times, and we laid all that out in the intro in the first part of the show. And Lee, we got to the point where we found out Mike Cernovich, who I always thought, was the one behind the deplorable. I had to suffer him on InfoWars and everything else like everyone else had to. And it's not the first time that Mike has taken credit for something that he isn't actually doing, but we can get to that. And I'm going to hand it back to you because this Jeff Giese character, now this was a new name on me today when I was doing the deep dive on all of your research and things. And I had trouble finding much about him at all. And I know you're a far better, more experienced researcher than I, but just for the audience out there, it was really strange because usually a character like this, somebody with money, you're not short of links to go looking at. But this guy, it's almost like he's been Google washed. So Lee, I'm going to hand it back to you. We got to the deplorable. And one last thing, and I think it's important for the audience. This Giese character, we're finding out now, he was basically the one that really originated this narrative that the Russians would be infiltrating the election before it even happened. And what a brilliant tactic if, and I'm speculating here because I don't know the facts, you do, but what a brilliant tactic for somebody if they were about to do that very same thing. Go and accuse somebody else, and that gives you perfect cover to be doing something on your own.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things I've learned is that the exact tactic that you're talking about is these guys have a very small playbook. I don't know how else to put it. If once you know what you're looking for, you'll see it over and over and over again. And that's why in the middle of the Russian narrative, this Skripal poisoning up in Salisbury, England, was just jumped out like, well, gee, that's interesting timing. Like, why would Russia do that? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, and why would they do it to this guy? And I actually went to Salisbury and investigated that. But I've seen that tactic over and over, and there's a lot of fishy stuff with that. But over and over and over again, you see this tactic. And let me give you one other example. I talked about Jeff Giese. I've been told by someone with direct knowledge of the situation had a secret, no one knew it was Jeff Giese, account that he controlled that was purposely tweeting out racist and anti-Semitic Trump memos, right? But let me give you another example. One of the guys that Jeff Giese backs is a guy named Jack Posobiec. Jack now is a reporter at One American News Network. Now, Jack is somebody who, again, for the record, I know Jack. I liked Jack. And Jack is very likable. Comes across very all-American, I've met his family at an event at CPAC, his father, very nice. And Jack's got a beautiful family and loves them. And he plays guitar and, was playing Over the Hills and Far Away by Led Zeppelin guitar. I'm like, that's pretty good. And so I'm just saying, I liked Jack. That being said, I have just realized what he's been up to. And people had kind of warned me, so I'm somewhat careful. But I'd given him stories before saying, interview this guy, and he'd done it. And it was a good interview. So it's like, okay. And so anyway, Jack, you can see that he literally worked for Giese. They had Mike Cernovich, Giese and Mike Cernovich started a PAC briefly. If you look up his name on opensecrets.org, that's a campaign finance website, you'll see he had this PAC. And you can see that Jack Posobiec got $15,000. That PAC was up for about 3 months. Jack got 15 grand for communication stuff, which that's fine. But I'm just saying that's being on the payroll, right? All I'm saying is that's not conjecture. So one of the things that Jack did in the run up to the election, and again, I've been told by somebody who knows this firsthand, but there's also photographic evidence, is that Jack apparently, again, according to this source who told me that they know, Jack apparently, in the run-up to the election, saw there was going to be a protest at the Trump Hotel, put on a Antifa costume, so his face was covered, and held up a sign that said "Rape Melania" outside the Trump Hotel. Then there were photos of Jack that are up there. But again, someone told me directly that this happened. Jack, for the record, I believe still denies it to this day. But again, I've been told by somebody who I know knows him and makes sense, and he gave me details that are corroborated with other information that I have, that Jack did that thing. And that to me should immediately disqualify you from journalism. Maybe you get a 5-year timeout or something, but you got to go away for a while. You can't say you're a journalist and fake a story. That was covered in the media. What they did was then they took a picture of it. But here's the thing. We can dismiss this as a childish prank. Jack's a fairly young guy. He's in his early 30s. Graduated from Temple University in, I believe, 2007. And then spent 2 years in China working for American businesses, according to his resume. It's a little vague on that, but he learned Chinese. Now, that's interesting. And
I'll say it. That sounds CIA-ish.
It does, yes. And he's in naval intelligence. His profile, he doesn't hide that in any way. He's in naval intelligence. So that's problematic. And you've got to remember that Jack was also the guy, along with Cernovich, pushing two things: the Pizzagate narrative, right? That's significantly important in this whole thing. And then more recently, I'll talk about this: a certain narrative about about Jeff Epstein that I'll talk about. That's where this starts to tie in. But this sort of tactic, but you could dismiss it as youthful indiscretion, or since he's connected with Jeff Geisia, who was running that exact same sort of operation, I am willing to say that there's a plan here. There's something that they're doing on purpose. They're clearly exhibiting a pattern of behavior that would indicate, in my opinion, a criminal conspiracy to defraud. And by the way, and I in terms of donations and a whole bunch of stuff, they were literally creating crises. And when I was at Breitbart, one of the things I covered was protest. I covered protest for years. I covered Black Lives Matter. I covered, back when Andrew Breitbart was alive, Occupy Wall Street. And so I noticed, and I stopped covering protest around the inauguration, because that was the biggest, craziest protests I'd ever seen outside of the Chicago Black Friday protests that I covered a couple of years before. That protest, they were getting more violent. The protests were getting ginned up and more violent. And what I'm suggesting is that I was actually unwittingly part of that by covering the protest. And that while a lot of, I have very strong criticisms of the left, and I believe that the left tolerates a philosophy, they tolerate violence openly and philosophically. Like if you ever read the work of Frantz Fanon, Wretched of the Earth, he just openly advocates for violence, and it's applauded as intellectualism. I don't see that on the right. That being said, there are clearly some bad actors on the right, but they don't have that same sort of academic, if you read Fanon, Wretched of the Earth, you can write your doctoral thesis right now. And, and so that's considered acceptable. That being said, I noticed stuff was getting worse. And I noticed a new generation of people started to come along who were deliberately instigating things and then crying about free speech. Laura Loomer, I would put in that category. Pam Geller was one of the people who sort of started it. Milo Yiannopoulos was part of it. And again, I know these people, and I'm not saying they're all in on some vast conspiracy where everyone gathered around the room and they said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to foment tensions. You're able to take somebody like Laura. I know Laura well enough to know that she's like that. The way, when you see her, she's not really acting too much. That's really the way she is. But I think she was probably used. People just support that sort of thing. They go, okay, well, let's throw some money behind that. Let's throw some fame behind it.
And let's use the intelligence term for it. I think it came from Russia way back in the day. Useful idiots.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
it's all compartmentalized, and I'm sure that none of them really know the big picture that's going on here, or maybe not all of them, maybe some do, Lee. But that's the way these operations work, right?
Some of them absolutely do, and some people, like I said, I'll use Laura as an example. I don't believe that she knew, and for whatever part I played in it, I always did honest journalism, but for whatever part I played in, I don't even know what part I played in it, um, really, because I believe Steve Bannon was clearly in on this through his connections to Thiel through the White House. That and again, I worked with Bannon, and some other stuff that I know about Steve, including his two meetings with Jeffrey Epstein. Now, if you met with Jeffrey Epstein in 2003, let's say, I could care less. Does that make sense?
Yep, absolutely.
Like, there's lots of people who met with him, they had no idea. Bannon met with him in 2016 before the election and in 2018. And you're only going to find one of those that's been reported so far. But he met with him in 2018 as well. And I have ample reason to believe, based on sources with direct knowledge of the situation, that Bannon also met with Jeff Epstein in 2016, prior to the election. So I think he has some explaining to do. I'm not finding him guilty of anything, but to me, why are you doing that? It's an obvious question that I think someone needs to ask him, and I believe he owes it to people to answer. Bannon's an interesting guy because again, he talks the rhetoric of populism, but he's a wannabe elitist. He's a guy from a working class background in Norfolk, Virginia, was in the Navy, saw how the world worked, got a Harvard MBA, and sort of built his media empire networking with the right people. And all of these people, let me say one thing about this. There's a huge foreign policy implication here, and it ties into the Epstein thing, which is this new free speech movement and the people that it's lionized, like Milo, like Laura, like Jacob Wall. They just had a free speech event, and it's these same people. There's a group called Gays for Trump. That's Peter Boykin, as I believe his name is. And again, I've had him on my radio show before. So he's got a group that was connected with this deplorable. They just did this free speech event. Laura was there, Jacob was there, Cernovich was supposed to be there. One of the things I've noticed about that movement is if they're a free speech movement, you'd think there'd be somebody up there maybe criticizing a U.S. policy on Israel or I mean, not everybody, but somebody, and there's nobody. Everybody there is pro-Zionist Israel, and specifically pro-Netanyahu Likud party, and I'll make that further distinction because a friend of mine, Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, talks about how he believes, and a lot of ultra-Orthodox Jews believe, that Zionism is anti-Semitic. So the easy accusation is not it's anti-Semitism. It's not. I believe people have taken advantage of Israel for financial purposes, and they use the defense of anti-Semitism so people won't look into their business activities. And that may take us to Genie Energy, but if I don't get to it, anybody look up the advisory board of Genie Energy, and you'll find at least 3 people directly connected to Jeff Epstein. Genie Energy holds the exclusive drilling rights to the oil in the Golan Heights, which Donald Trump just gave to Israel. He's recognized it. And whatever you think about that issue, go look up Alan Dershowitz, Golan Heights, and you'll see he advised President Trump on this. And so, in other words, these business interests, 3 people, if the Epstein operation is a blackmail operation, let's say, I think it's to advance some financial objectives and foreign policy objectives. And the foreign policy objectives aren't just about protecting Israel because these people love the state of Israel and Judaism so much. It's not about that for them. It's about money. It's about the oil under the Golan Heights. They don't care about the rest of it. They just use that. That's the excuse they use. Some of these people, another guy who's on there is Michael Steinhardt. Look him up. He's on the advisory board of Genie Energy. He connects to this mega group. He's an atheist. He doesn't care about this. It's not religious for him. He's on the Genie Energy Board, and he's part of this mega group of donors that was led by Les Wexner, who's Jeffrey Epstein's his only client, apparently. He's the one who gave him that mansion, that $77 million mansion.
This is good
He
because
gave it to him.
this links into the show I done last week with Charlie Robinson, everyone. And if you listen to that, you'll hear Les Wexner, the guy behind Victoria's Secret, a key ally, and probably the guy who bankrolled and set up Epstein.
Yes. Oh, no, he is. He's clearly, because he sold him that mansion for $1. It's one of those deals where he gave him the mansion, right? And why would you do that? Well, Epstein was collecting, according to what the victims said, he bragged about. These victims, by the way, this story hasn't gotten out much, but it's true. When you read the victims, Epstein's victims' depositions or statements they made to the police when they were being interviewed, they said, multiple victims said, they would hear him threaten people. They were all afraid of him because they would hear him threaten to kill people, threaten to break their legs, that kind of thing. He admitted to them that he would use blackmail. Now, here's the thing. When we talk about the deep state, if the wrong conclusion to jump to is that I'm saying that Epstein was a deep state, operative or a Mossad agent, that's not what I'm getting at. Actually, we don't even need that. He could have been an asset to them. In other words, here's a guy who's blackmailing people. He's got information. Who would buy that? And the answer is state actors. Could be Israel, could be the UK, could be the US. Seems to be some connections there. Could be
and his
criminals.
girlfriend. I mean, his girlfriend, the daughter of Robert Maxwell, a blatant Mossad agent stroke asset.
Yes. And notice she came into his life. And by the way, she's close to the Clintons, and Ghislaine Maxwell's fascinating in this whole thing, and as is Robert Maxwell. And when you look at those connections, now let me tie this back to the first part of the story.
Yeah.
The connection here is Alan Dershowitz. Alan Dershowitz is Epstein's friend, lawyer, and a close friend. Once Dershowitz lost money on an investment that Epstein had suggested to him, and Epstein went to the person and said, it's in your interest to make Mr. Dershowitz whole. And the guy paid Epstein back the money. That's documented. And so that's a friend. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Very few friends would go to somebody who, and say, you better pay Lee the money he lost on his investment with you. And that's how close they are. Now, Alan Dershowitz has been friends with 15 years since Chuck Johnson, that's his name, Charles Johnson. Since Chuck Johnson was 16 years old. I know Chuck. Chuck's very smart. Chuck, when he was 16, was, precocious 16-year-old. Dershowitz came to his high school. Dershowitz was impressed by Chuck's intelligence and hired him. Chuck is the link to Jeff Giesea. And this is where everything starts to tie in. Chuck, if you look up Jeff Giesea and Deplorable, you'll see it's not just that they know each other. It's that Jeff Giesea has said, when I met Chuck, I was thinking to myself, how can we weaponize a guy like this? He says it right in the article. And he's friends with Chuck. In fact, that Stratcom paper I mentioned mentions Chuck Johnson. He says, I was having beers with my friend Chuck Johnson last year. So Jeff's known him for some time. And Jeff Giesea is the reason, Chuck Johnson bragged to people close to him. He's the reason Jeff Giesea donated to Richard Spencer. It was at his suggestion. He's the reason Jeff was doing stuff like this. And what was happening was elements, including Jack Posobiec, including obviously Jeff Giesea, who gave money to Richard Spencer, were palling around with people as part of the white supremacist movement. And I think they used, and by the way, Spencer agrees with this, and Spencer feels that the white supremacist movement was used by these guys for the energy it had, for the other stuff that it had, right? And used it to sort of pump up. And Richard Spencer recently called out Trump on the conversation we had. He called out Trump for race baiting, and I was like, I think you're right. What they've done is, I think that Trump has been pushed sort of into these things that are clearly race baiting and tiptoe. They don't get that close to the edge of actual white supremacist talk. So people, if they're not racist, don't see it. But people, if they're looking for it, people on the left go, aha, that's a dog whistle. I know exactly what they're talking about. I know why they use that name, because often our opponents, I learned this when I used to be a Democrat. I'd never read Alinsky. I'd never read Saul Alinsky. Then when I came over to the right, when I met Andrew Breitbart, he said, have you read Alinsky? I'm like, no. Well, a lot of conservatives have read Alinsky. And none of my liberal friends have read Alinsky, but we all meant to get around to it someday because we heard he was really smart. But that's what happens, right? You don't see what's going on your side as clearly as you do on your opponent's side. And these guys are very smart. They understand how data works. They understand how memes work.
And I'm even
so
looking, I'm looking at a quote here. Sorry to cut you off, Lee, but I'm looking at a quote that really fits, and it's from this geezer. It's a BuzzFeed article, and it's talking about him, Peter Thiel, deplorable. And it says, quote, trolling, it might be said, is the social media equivalent of guerrilla warfare.
Yes. And that is echoing what he says in this NATO Stratcom paper that you can find at academia.edu, but you're going to have to pay him $10. And I don't make anything. I had to pay the $10. I'm warning you. But that paper, but you can, you know what? You can find a link on the NATO Stratcom site. By the way, some of this stuff has been pulled down. Like, I'll just mention real quickly. I've been reporting this Genie Energy thing for about 2 years, way before this Golan Heights deal came up. About 3 months before the Golan Heights deal, suddenly Genie Energy took down their strategic advisory page that listed Larry Summers and Bill Richardson and these guys who were connected with Epstein, but they just took down Jacob Rothschild and James Woolsey and big names, Dick Cheney. And so they removed it, and I knew something was up, and that's why the Golan Heights deal didn't surprise me, because I'm like, something's up here. So in the past couple of years, when I started to, I didn't, all this stuff I've been talking about, let me give you credit, that you and a lot of other people understood in 2014 and 15 about Bohemian Grove. And I was one of those people who it sounded like craziness to me. And so I didn't call it crazy because I didn't really know much about it, but I didn't know about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfectly. Yeah, we've all been there.
And so I thought I was smart because I had come from the left, and I knew I was understanding the way the left lied. I didn't understand this other level. And in the past 2 years, through having a lot of great guests on my radio show and a lot of reading and studying about the history of the CIA, and all these other secret society groups, and watching videos from guys like you mentioned, I'm like, oh, okay, this is real. And this is real. This part, people go a little too far. Let me explain what's happening here. These guys are wannabe deep state. That's what I think Geesia is. And that's what I think people who work for him are. They're wannabe deep state. They want the money that would come from, and you can see it in that Stratcom paper. They want the money that would come from a gigantic contract like Thiel got with Palantir. Does that make sense?
Yep.
These are guys who are businessmen, right? And they're looking for the next thing that they can pitch to the Pentagon and the UN and whoever. Does that make sense? And so, therefore, some of their behavior seems like they're an actual government deep state actor. Does that make sense?
Yep.
But in fact, they may not be. They just may, in other words, it's like if they were a guy who killed somebody to try to get into the mob.
It's almost like a coup of the deep state. They're trying to take over what the deep state really have been doing forever, right? They're a new gang on the block.
And that's specifically what these guys are trying to do with media. Again, this is from sources who work directly. Multiple sources are talking to me now. Their plan, Geesia and Cernovich and Posobiec, their plan was is to take over the media. That's their plan, to take over the media. And they explicitly believe in and I'm not going to debate the philosophy, but this is their philosophy. There's no objective reality. Perception is reality. They don't really believe in ethics, therefore. And that's just what they say. They will tell you, in meme world, it's only perception. And I beg to differ. And I think a lot of people, what they've taken advantage of the fact is that the mainstream media absolutely is horrible. And so they've taken these people who are like, I trusted the mainstream media, and now I don't. Where do I go? And they go to Breitbart, and they go to the Daily Caller if they're on the right, or maybe they go to Raw Story if they're on the left, but they've taken over both sides. I worked for Huffington Post. I worked for Breitbart. completely co-opted now, completely co-opted. And so on this Epstein story, Mike Cernovich made himself the point man on the right, because everybody now only listens to their own media. Mike Cernovich became the pitch man by filing a suit in 2017 to open the records. Now, his fans believe, and people donated, because they think he's sued Jeffrey Epstein. That is false. He did not sue Jeffrey Epstein. He, in fact, sued a victim. And William Craddock has a great site called Disobedient Media. And he'd written about this about 3-4 months ago. And I hadn't read it. So when he was a guest on my radio show, I said, well, what do you think about Cernovich not getting credit? And William was like, well, let me tell you, I've investigated that and I don't think it's true. And when I looked at the court filings, everything William said was exactly right, which is Mike Cernovich has falsely given the impression that he sued Jeff Epstein. In fact, he was suing after Alan Dershowitz did, because Alan Dershowitz was accused of rape by this woman, Virginia Roberts, who filed a lawsuit against Ghislaine Maxwell, a civil suit. Alan Dershowitz had tried to open documents in 2016, tried to unseal them because he thinks they'll let him off. He was turned down. Along comes Cernovich Media, pushed by an attorney named Mark Randazza, whose idea it was to file the suit. Now, Cernovich is now saying, well, he's like, I don't like Alan Dershowitz. But at the time, 2016, he said Alan Dershowitz was his inspiration for going to law school.
Hold that thought, Lee. Hold that thought. Lee Stranahan is my very special guest today, and I want to thank Lee again for coming on and taking the time out to lay all of this out for all of us here and anyone who watches on YouTube or listens in the archive. And understand that Lee is actually currently putting all of this together in a book, so that doubly makes me appreciate your time today, Lee. And just before we launch back into it, we might have new listeners here, and we're kind of, over the past years or so, folks, you've heard me saying there's something far wrong in the alternative media, in the truth movement, stuff like that. Myself, Scott Lopez, Joe Joseph, Popeye, multiple people on my show, we've all talked about it. But we could never quite put our finger on what was going on, and we certainly couldn't name any of the characters behind it. Yet here we are today with Lee Stranahan. And Lee, you can find Lee's work over at stranahan.com. I urge you all to do that. You get a newsletter on there. Follow him on Twitter as well. That keeps you up to date with all the periscopes, stuff like that. And just before we got to the break there, Lee, we were getting to the real kind of current events. And that is Cernovich and the link to Epstein. And the reason I was really keen as well to get you on was because I've always had a bad feeling about Cernovich, could never back it up. But then here he was, the darling, the self-proclaimed darling of the alt-right, almost like our Lord and Saviour to some people out there, because they honestly believe if it wasn't for Mike Cernovich, Jeffrey Epstein would still be walking about a free man. But that's not the case, Lee.
Not at all. No, not at all. And if you look at his own site, Cernovich.com, and you watch the way he pitches it, he's very careful to imply that, and by the way, you can also, if you compare what he quotes to the actual court filing, you'll see that he cuts out Alan Dershowitz's name. Now, here's the thing. So some people are confused by this because they go, well, wait a minute. Mike Cernovich says he doesn't like Alan Dershowitz. Look, he's saying he doesn't like him. But then I go, well, look what he said here. He said it was his inspiration. They go, yeah, but he doesn't like him now. Okay. This lawsuit was not Cernovich's idea. According to him, his lawyer contacted him. He wasn't following this. The lawyer said to him, let's file here. And that lawyer, Mark Randazza, is avowedly and explicitly pro-Dershowitz. He wrote an article on his own blog at Randazza Law. You can find it Legal Satyricon in 2015, saying Alan Dershowitz has been accused of rape by Virginia Roberts, and I don't buy it for myself. And maybe he did, but, trying to set, like some doubt, right? So he's the guy who filed the legal papers. Mark Randazza, go look at the legal papers. It's in Cernovich's name. So what clearly happened was he was client shopping. He saw this Randazza, saw a suit, then went to the client and said explicitly what happened, and then said, hey, I think you should file in this. Maybe it'd be good for you publicity-wise. That's what Mr. Rendez has told me he did it for. He said, I was trying to help him get a story because it's First Amendment and everything else. Mike has pitched this to people, and he's very cagey about the way he phrases it. Like the records were sealed in the case of Jeffrey Epstein. True. 2009, they were sealed when he pled guilty. And that's wrong. Absolutely true. I have filed in a case involving Jeffrey Epstein. Aha. He's not filing like the victims are. The victims since 2009, the victims that Alan Dershowitz has called prostitutes and liars, those victims that his friend, two of whom accused Alan Dershowitz in 2014 of having sex with them while they were minors, being given to him by Jeffrey Epstein, two different witnesses who he's called prostitutes and liars. That same Alan Dershowitz, who was accused of that in 2014, Randazza is in favor of him. And so he says it on his own blog. I know you didn't do anything. Now he comes along, he gets Cernovich to file this, but he files the paper. Cernovich doesn't plead this himself. Randazza does all the paperwork. Again, look at the legal papers. You'll see that. Now, the victim, Virginia Roberts, whose name is now Giuffre, Giuffre, and you can find Giuffre versus Reynolds. But I'll call her Roberts because I have trouble with Giuffre sometimes. So Virginia, you can find this out there kind of easier. Virginia Roberts, that victim, was smeared by Chuck Johnson in 2015 as well on Got News. Specifically, Chuck Johnson had a site. And again, see, here's the thing. If you didn't like the mainstream media and you just got what they call red pilled, and you're like, the mainstream media is lying to me, you don't want to be lied to by people just because they're wearing MAGA hats, right? Got News published a story that I know firsthand Chuck had reason to believe was completely not true, based on people Chuck talked to, but also based, Chuck Johnson, you can find it on Wayback Machine. He's pulled down the site. On his site, Got News, did something saying, he did multiple stories attacking Virginia Roberts in 2015. Multiple stories. Now, again, this is a guy who Yisia said Chuck Johnson was his inspiration in this whole thing. It's directly connected to Cernovich, who works with Garcia for him, basically. Garcia is the guy who bankrolled all this stuff. Garcia also bankrolls, by the way, he's on boards, and he bankrolls some of these big conservative conventions that push people like Candace Owens or Charlie Kirk, right? I believe he's on the board, and I got to check this, so don't quote me on. I believe he's on the board of Turning Point USA, which they're on, I believe, but I could be incorrect. Previously, he's been with Students for Liberty, a libertarian organization. And so again, he's putting his money into promoting himself as a libertarian guy, but really, like I say, he's trying to sell, he's doing the most, to me, libertarians are anti-war. I've known libertarian philosophy since I was 14 years old, and I went to Ayn Rand's funeral when I was 16. So I go back. I understand libertarianism back to 1980, and Clark ran. And libertarians are anti-war. Whatever disagreements they have about anarcho-capitalism or whatever, they're anti-war because they understand that war and empire are tied directly to people losing their liberty, right? So if they pitch themselves as libertarian, funds libertarian organizations, meanwhile, he's an elitist doing exactly what elitists do, which is create problems. And so clearly, through this network of fake news, and we talked about the way they did it with these memes before, but let's talk about it with this case. Chuck Johnson was smearing the victim, and he admits in the articles, he says, I worked for Alan Dershowitz, full disclosure, so there's not a question about that. Dershowitz, by the way, just a day or two ago, this story came out, defended Chuck Johnson and said Chuck Johnson is, he said some things that may sound like he's a Holocaust denier, right? But he's really not. Well, I know Chuck. I've talked to Chuck. Chuck is a racist and anti-Semite, and I don't throw those words around lightly. He's a guy who's told me black people are stupid. He's talked about Jews and stuff like that. He's blatantly, and everyone who knows Chuck knows that as well. And as I say, he's the guy who got Jeff Geisia to give Richard Spencer, the white supremacist, $5,000. So there you go. So, and because Chuck had said that to me, I don't deal with Chuck, and haven't dealt with him, and had contemporaneous conversations where I said to people who will say, I was like, I can't deal, man. Chuck is racist and pretty and fairly dangerous, and because he is, I consider Chuck to be a dangerous person, actually, and so Chuck is the guy who's explicitly behind this. Now, he's the one who got him to give the money to the white supremacists. So there's no guess here. Chuck is spinning these pro-Dershowitz stories. Chuck told people at the time, again, this is from people with direct knowledge of the situation, that he had met with Epstein. This is 2015, 2016. And that Prince Andrew, who's featured in the picture that Chuck says is fake, it's that famous picture of Prince Andrew with his arm wrapped around the girl's midriff, who looks to be like 16, because I think she is 16 or 17. And Ghislaine Maxwell standing in the background smiling. That picture, that's the picture that Chuck said was fake. Now, that is fake news. Chuck published an intentionally false story to help Dershowitz push a narrative. Now, the other stuff I know personally from working at Breitbart is that another guy who's known Dershowitz for a long time, over 10 years, is Joel Pollack. Joel is an editor-in-chief at Breitbart. He was the editor-in-chief. He's the host of their evening radio show. I've known Joel. I consider Joel a good person. Again, lovely family, and I consider him a good person. But he was the first Republican that Alan Dershowitz ever endorsed. He's talked to me multiple times about how he's friends with Dershowitz. He doesn't hide it, and he's close to Alan Dershowitz. And what I'm suggesting is, Alan Dershowitz, who's been accused of rape by two people, the coverage on the right has been abysmal. But let's think about what's going on here. Like, why? Why would this happen? Because after Donald Trump got elected, Alan Dershowitz smartly started engaging in a PR campaign where he was like, well, I'm the guy who voted for Hillary, but I really don't think the press is treating Trump fairly right now. Right. So Alan Dershowitz would go on TV appearances, and lots of people on the right who were Trump supporters, who normally wouldn't like a leftist Democrat who defended OJ and Klaus von Bülow, that might not be their favorite guy. Right. Suddenly they're like, that Alan Dershowitz, he seems pretty good and reasonable. And of course, Breitbart, and I haven't seen Joel. And by the way, Joel knows Chuck as well, and knew him back from those Harvard days when Charles Johnson was working for Dershowitz, and Joel Pollack was a student of Dershowitz's. Joel went to Harvard Law, so I know that all that personally, but it's all out there on the record. What I'm suggesting is that Alan Dershowitz is engaging in a very smart public relations campaign and taking advantage of the media bubble culture we live in. And he knows that people on the right don't read sites on the left, let's say, the Daily Beast, let's say. Let's say you're the average Breitbart Daily Caller reader, right? You read Gateway Pundit, you know who you like. You maybe read Daily Signal, Ben Shapiro's publication. You read publications like that, right? Okay. You don't read Daily Beast. That if you did, you would find all these accusations against Dershowitz. You don't see them on the right. And anybody can look at Breitbart's reporting. When Epstein was rearrested a month ago, if you look at Breitbart's story on that by Alan Bakari, and again, I know Alan, he mentions Cernovich wins case, gets Epstein arrested. As the headline, something like that. It was Cernovich, the spirit of Andrew Breitbart, who I was close friends with, and Andrew said I was the best working experience of his life. Cernovich had never heard of him until 2015. He's admitted that. He's like, and Mike Cernovich says spirit of Andrew Breitbart is alive. It's a very pandering headline, and Andrew would rise out of his grave and smack him in the face because he's a liar and a fraudster, and that story made no mention of the fact that Alan Dershowitz had been accused by two women, one of whom had a defamation suit that's still in the courts right now, saying that he had sex with them. Now, you don't have to make that case, but journalistically, you'd mention it. Journalistically, you'd say Dershowitz, comma, who's accused by two victims but remains innocent until whatever. He strongly denies the charges. That's what you do. It's two sentences, and you put that in, and you might even say full disclosure. Joel Pollack, our editor in chief, is friends with blah blah blah. Nothing. I've never seen that disclosure, and uh, and I am not saying that Mike Cernovich was acting as the tool of Alan Dershowitz, but Virginia Joffrey's attorney, made that argument, and Mike never talked about it. All you have to do is read her legal brief, her lawyer put together for her, and they say that Cernovich is acting as an agent of Alan Dershowitz, and they make a very compelling case showing the photos of Mike with Alan Dershowitz, him saying he's my inspiration. They don't make any mention of Chuck Johnson or Jeff Geisia because they don't know that relationship. They don't know that Chuck was working with Jeff Geisia and Jeff Geisia was funding. And Jack Posobiec, who I mentioned earlier, after this happened and it's the tweet's still up there. And I said I was friendly with Jack. I asked Jack, assuming that it was an innocent error. I'm like, because he posted, he said, back when we were planning the deplorable, Mike suddenly said, I'm suing Jeffrey Epstein. And now Epstein's been arrested. There's no causal connection, as we talked about. But Jack saying that, I corrected him. I said, he didn't actually sue Epstein. He sued in a civil case. Jack blocked me. Then he unblocked me, which means I unfollowed him. He played this game for a couple of days. To this day, he has not answered a single, and all I'm asking you to do is say, look, did Mike say to you that I'm suing Epstein, or did you misremember it? Are you using shorthand? If Jack had said to me, you know what, he actually explained, I'm suing in a civil case involving, but I shortened it to that, and if anyone's confused, sorry. That's easy. You could do that, right? He just won't say a single solitary word about it.
And well, for me, I mean, he was coming along and boomed onto the scene around the same time as Laura Loomer, sorry, as you mentioned. And she's got an article up very similar to what you're talking about here. It excludes to mention the fact about Dershowitz filing and being rejected for these papers previously. And
yes.
What really gets me, and I've covered this topic a few times, and it's really depressing, it's really dark, but this whole child exploitation, pedophilia stuff, you've got Mike Cernovich, the Pizzagate pusher, and let's not even get into that Psy-Op, who's out there, as many are right now, on the face of it, looking as if they're standing up for victims and for child's rights. Yet here we are. The truth of the matter is, Mike Cernovich, Pizzagate pusher, protector of children, is actually suing one of the victims, and it happens to be concerning information that an accused, and he is accused, he hasn't been to a court yet, so it's just an accusation, Dershowitz, so he can see what he's been accused of beforehand. See, this is why I say, Lee, it's almost like there's devils in MAGA hats, and not everything, in fact, nothing is what it seems.
Well, yeah, and what I've said is Mike raised money on this too, and I said it's the equivalent of raising money for 9/11 victims and giving it to Al Qaeda. It's that bad. He was raising money to support a lawsuit that, again, forget what Mike's saying. Look at what the victim said about the filing. Look at the person whose idea it was. Mark Randazzo is explicitly pro Dershowitz. Chuck Johnson, was working with Mike at the time on Got News stuff, is explicitly, and as I talked about, Jeff Geisia and his employee, Jack Posobiec, his one-time employee, Jack Posobiec, have been engaged in clear fraud. Now, let's talk about Pizzagate for a second. Let's think about this. The Cernovich story is significantly different than the real story in the following respects. In the Mike Cernovich, well, there's an old joke. Let me tell the old joke. The old joke is two actors are talking, and one actor says to the other, I just got a big part. And the other actor says, oh, really? What is it? And he goes, I'm in Macbeth. And he goes, wow, that's a big part. He goes, who are you playing? A gravedigger. And you go, oh, okay. And he goes, so I feel embarrassed. I've never actually read Macbeth. What's it about? Or it's Hamlet. Forgive me, I screwed up the thing anyway. But he says, like the gravedigger. He goes, I've never read that. And he goes, well, it's about this gravedigger. And he, and if you know that part, the gravedigger part's a very small part. But everybody thinks everything's about them. I get that. That's what happens. But Mike's story puts Mike Cernovich at the center of it. And this is not just ego. Because as I say, there's a lot more behind Cernovich. It's an operation. So he's presenting a persona. I'm not saying he doesn't have an ego. I'm not saying everybody doesn't. But his story, by putting himself at the center, what it obscures is the fact that the victims, Virginia Roberts among them, and these other Jane Does who've since come forward, have been suing since 2008. They want the full criminal record unsealed in this case. They were cut out of it. Now, Mike doesn't tell you that part. Nor does it. Now, by the way, if he wanted to unseal records, that's the suit to file in. He doesn't file in that one. Doesn't have anything to do with that one. He sues in this other one related to Epstein, but that's explicitly trying to get information that would benefit Dershowitz. It was the same information. Mike asked for more, but it's the same, included the same information Dershowitz asked for. It's a limited part of the record. The Miami Herald eventually sued, and it was granted to everybody, but the reason it was is the Miami Herald sued to get the entire record unleashed. Mike wasn't asking for the entire record. He was cherry picking, and that was part of what the victim says. But anyway, so imagine if you're Epstein and Dershowitz, and you see this train coming, and the train is these lawsuits started by the victim in 2008 are headed towards a conclusion. The victims filed under the Florida Criminal Rights Act, Criminal Victims Rights Act, forgive me, where they were supposed to be notified according to Florida law, and they weren't. So the whole case is about to be unsealed, and that's going to be bad for Epstein and Dershowitz and other people. Dershowitz, I'm not saying Dershowitz slept with him, I don't know, but I'm saying that she's been accused by that credibly, and by somebody who's done it under oath, and multiple victims said it. And the person who had the little black book said he saw Epstein at the house with underage girls around. So it's at least an accusation, and it's being obscured because now, so imagine you see this train coming, right? And you have connections to a meme war factory that uses the media like Jeff Garcia has, right? You have access to that. You're Chuck Johnson, you have access to Garcia, you're friends with Dershowitz, and you're smart. My hypothesis here, and of course, until they confess, I can't know, but my hypothesis is Pizzagate, which we know that Cernovich and Posobiec spread that, was a way to distract from the actual real issue of pedophilia among the elites by creating a false story that would make anybody who talked about pedophilia in the elites seem crazy and stupid. Like, oh, you're one of those pizza. No one had heard of Pizzagate before. And so just think about this. Now, if you say to yourself, well, who would think that way? My answer would be Jeff Garcia and Charles Johnson, obviously, because they talk about it. They admit they're doing Psy-Ops. They use that word. They're doing Psy-Ops. So again, people on the right go, well, that's okay. They're on our side. I'm questioning that. I'm saying that these guys are the link between the Epstein case, which is a train that's going to come out. And when it does, news is going to be made. But let's see if we can distract from it. Let's see if we can make the Trump camp look stupid the way Jack Posobiec, the way Jack Posobiec held it to make the left look stupid, the way Jeff Garcia was pitching memes to make the right look bad. These are people who've engaged in that pattern of behavior before.
And let's add in there, Lee. Sorry to interrupt you again, but I think it's important because this Randazza character, you were on Unirock's show just recently over on YouTube, and he was back on again last night, showing the connection between this Randazza, who's a lawyer, and he has represented the guy who owns 8chan, and his son is somebody called Code Monkey. Now, Code Monkey is somebody very instrumental in something else we haven't mentioned tonight, but I think we need to, and it's QAnon. Because QAnon, for me, before I knew what it was, I used to say, well, if nothing else, it's going to end up making the Trump base, genuine MAGA people, look like absolute maniacs.
Right.
And I find it very interesting. One last point is the major kind of pusher of the Q stuff, the face of it, like Cernovich is the face of all these characters you're talking about. The Patriot Soapbox on YouTube, they push Q constantly 24/7. And the language they used in a specific broadcast is interesting because you used it here today. And they talked about the fact how they're going to replace InfoWars and the rest of the media. And they were just a channel with a few thousand subs at the time, Lee. You know, you're thinking, what's going on here? So we can see this connection between all of it.
So, and again, I don't know this to be the case because until these people answer some questions, we won't know. But let's say you're Jeff Giesier, right? Let's say you're Jeff Giesier and your great-grandfather was the president of the Bohemian Club, as he's admitted. And you feel some connection because you feel enough where you mention it to people. You're talking, it's something you're ashamed of. You're proud of it. Alex Jones is a guy you'd like to discredit, isn't he? He's a guy you'd like to put out a bit. If you're in the Bohemian Club, I assume you're not an Alex Jones fan. Is that fair to say that's possible? And there's some history there. So how can you get him, right? You can't get him by attacking him from the left because that doesn't work. And by the way, another guy who's connected to this, who I know, Ali Alexander, real name Ali Akbar. Ali, and I've known Ali for 8 years. And, but Ali connects to a lot of these people as well. And he's worked with them. And Ali has co-hosted Alex Jones and stuff like that. He's been on Cernovich, as you know, Cernovich has, Posobiec has. I can tell you, Alex does not know who Jeff Giesier is, but I think Jeff Giesier absolutely knows who Alex Jones is and might have some motivation to want to take him down. But the other motivation all of these guys have is they want to take over the media, and they want to put InfoWars out of business, because and people with firsthand knowledge of the situation said that these guys, that's explicitly what they're talking about. Cernovich, people see him. You'll see I have, like, I don't know, people are watching on, if you're not watching on video, this won't make any sense, but I have a sort of nice looking set behind me, and it's soft focus. It looks pretty good, right? And I've done that work, but that's some work one person can do. Now,
well, ladies and gentlemen, we have had the pleasure of Lee Stranahan's company today. You can find him over on Sputnik News. And of course, many of our listeners will be having a laugh out there that they say that I've got some kind of love affair with Vladimir Putin. Now I have somebody with Russian media connections on. I can hear the trolls already. But that's okay. If you can't laugh at yourself, then you shouldn't laugh at anyone else. But all joking aside, this has been one of the most important broadcasts that I have had the pleasure and honor of being a part of in a long time. And it's very important because of everything we've spoken about over the months and years about what's gone on with the alternative media. The fact that we were so close, everyone waking up to all of the lies in the world, and then all of a sudden, thousand after thousand of people got dragged back into a left-right paradigm. They got weaponized, the rise of this thing called the alt-right, and the infiltration by bad actors, Psy-Ops, and people that are just outright liars for their own purposes. And Lee, before we get back into this, I know that you're hurriedly putting together a book to document everything we're talking about, and I'm certainly going to be somebody buying one of those books when it comes out, because this is so important. It might be one of those things we have to go over time and time again to really make it sink in, all of these connections and what's going on here. And I know that you've been asking for help in writing this book, so I'll give it over to you, Lee, to speak to the audience. And then the floor is yours. You take us where we need to go if I have anything I want to interject. But this story is so important, and you're the one that's put it together. So over to you, Lee.
well, yeah, let me remind, I got to remember to come to the social media point, because you're making a great point about social media, and I'll come to that after I do the sales pitch, which is I'm putting this together in a book that I'm trying to get together quickly. But if people have listened, I'm not reading. This is all in my head. So what you're hearing is kind of an outline of what you go through and you prove in the book and you show and you illuminate. But I'm doing the book in an interesting way, which is I'm writing it very transparently. People can literally watch me write the book. And it's boring because it's words on a page, but it's kind of interesting. And it's the kind of thing you could leave up on a screen and then come, go watch a show and then come back and 15 minutes later read the paragraph. Oh, okay, Lee didn't do much, or oh, he got a bunch written or whatever. And people are going to have access to that. They're going to get a digital copy of the book and the audio book I'm going to do. That's like a $30 value. And if people want to help out and be a patron of the book, and I can put their name in it or not, I'm going to leave it up to the people. If they could send $51, I use that amount so we can identify them, to paypal.me/Lee Stranahan. My full name, Lee Stranahan, no spaces. And you'll see it says Stranahan Strategies. And if anyone donates $51, we'll add you to the list. You'll get copies of this stuff. And significantly, you'll really help me out in telling the story. Because as you mentioned, Kev, this is, I'm in a race against time in the sense, the quicker I get as much of this material out in the public as I can, the safer I feel me and my family are. Does that make sense? And
it really does make sense, Lee. And not only that, I mean, it's not very often I get the chance to say this, and it's not very often I ever want to say this, but publicly, I mean, you're not having any suicidal thoughts, anything like that, not planning on offing yourself sometime soon, Lee, because
no,
these are powerful people that we're talking about here. And I'm not making light of that. I'm being deadly serious.
No, my son's just moved back. I have work. I enjoy being a journalist, and this is a big story. And part of the big story, I will tell you, the big story I've been working on the past couple of years is the DNC Ukraine collusion story. That's a major story, but it ties into this world of elites and money laundering, and we go over all of that in the book. I'm giving just how the right was fooled on this. This is part of the book. The book really goes into detail about Jeff Epstein's connections to Israeli intelligence, his connections to UK intelligence, his connections to US intelligence. It goes on some of the criminal background, and it also starts to hint at how this relates to money laundering. When I figured out, when everything clicked for me on the Epstein story, because of I had the same experience you're talking about. Things felt wrong in areas A, B, and C that I'd seen personally with Steve Bannon, I'd seen with Milo Yiannopoulos, I'd seen with the rise of Cernovich and Jack Posobiec. And again, these are people I know, have met, and in some cases I'm friends with. Things were a little off, and I couldn't put it. And then once I saw the Epstein thing, it all clicked. It's like these are, the way I said before, it's not like the world is made up of deep state agents or non-agents. There's this whole world in between of what I will call assets, And a friend of mine asked me, why would Alan Dershowitz work with Chuck Johnson? You said Chuck's racist and anti-Semitic. And why would you work with him? Because you need a guy like Chuck. If you're going to spin this kind of psyop on the world, if you're going to spin this kind of information war, right? You're not going to do it. You're going to want full spectrum dominance. You're not going to just say, well, we're going to infest the left. You'll infest the left and the right. And I'd seen it in the DNC Ukraine story with Fox News, specifically in this billionaire Bill Browder, this billionaire front guy. He's not really a billionaire. The billionaire is Khodorkovsky. And I'd seen, and anybody can look this up, Senate Resolution 322, coincidental, interesting bill numbering, by the way, but it's easy to remember. In 2006, no one who knows who Khodorkovsky is, but if you look Resolution 322, 2006, it's a bill in favor of this guy Khodorkovsky, and the three people on it, it's introduced by Joe Biden, and the two co-sponsors are John McCain and Barack Obama. So in other words, the two people who would run for president are both supporting this Russian billionaire that nobody's heard about. And once you start to look into Khodorkovsky, it's like, oh, he's connected to Soros and that whole line. So I've been working on that story which intersects with the Epstein story because Bill Browder was partnered with Maxwell was one of his early investors. And his next investors were Edmund Safra, who was killed mysteriously right after he'd signed over, and Bill Browder was partnered with HSBC. HSBC is the British banking giant, the Hong Kong and Shanghai banking company, and they got their start as laundering money for the opium dealers in like the 1900s. That's how that bank started. But they're a major money laundering bank, and that bit of the story starts to connect that Trump-Russia narrative with James Comey, who was on the board, and this guy Bill Browder. So I had seen this world, and I knew. And once I saw Ghislaine Maxwell on list, I was like, wait a minute. I know about Maxwell from Browder, and I started to piece together what I knew about Maxwell and money laundering. And if you look at Epstein, he's got Les Wexner, the guy who's his funder, was reported to have mob ties in Ohio in a court filing or something like that. People can find that. So he's the Victoria's Secret guy, the limited guy. Yes, he's that guy. But he's also said to have mob connections. And I knew that HSBC had been money laundering, and they pled guilty to that. And Jeffrey Epstein was a major thing. So there's this world of globalist elites, and money laundering is a big part of their operation because they need to take the receipts, whether it's for the deep state military, CIA black bag operations, or maybe just for this drug lord that the CIA is sponsoring, like Noriega, right? Or maybe it's just for criminals. Maybe it's just for regular drug runners. But money laundering shows up here everywhere. And once all of that clicked into place for me, I realized that there's a book that I could get written quickly, and I had to get it written quickly because this is not going to be, it's, as you can tell, I think it's going to be a fairly dense book. It's going to be fully give you all the links, but I'm going to really tell people, here's a bit about this. And if you're interested in reading more on money laundering, go read the work of like Lucy Commissar, who's a great investigative reporter. I'm going to try to hand off. So it's going to be a dense book that is sort of like a guide to all of the issues that connect to the Jeffrey Epstein case. And I'm not talking 2 degrees or 1 degree. I'm talking no degrees of separation. Jeff Epstein was a major shareholder in HSBC, and I mentioned the Genie Energy thing. All of this stuff ties together, and I'm going to show you how that ties together.
And Lee, as somebody that's watched you for, not a great length of time, over a year, like I was sharing with you before the show, I just want to assure anyone listening, anyone who hasn't heard of you before, you really know how to do your research and you back it up. And that's why I'm fascinated to see once you've put all of this together, brother. I really, really am.
Yeah, well, and again, a lot of it is based, I will tell you, the one mistake, I have a thing called Citizen Journalism School at citizenjournalismschool.com. And one of the mistakes that some citizen journalists make is that they do some research and maybe they only do one level of research. And we talk about how to do that at my school. But the other mistake that they make is they don't actually interview people. So they'll see something and they won't talk to people about what they're seeing, and they jump to conclusions that turn out to be erroneous. I interview people, and I try to get as much of that interview on the record as possible. Sometimes, in this case, all of Epstein's victims said that they were afraid of him. That's why his case didn't come forward. With this book, I am burning tremendous amounts of bridges. I think Mike Cernovich has committed criminal fraud because he raised donations falsely. And I wouldn't say that. I've been sued. I've never lost, but I wouldn't say that. These are people who have lawyers and everything. I'm less worried about them killing me, actually, than I'm about them suing me. So I have to be absolutely scrupulous. But my friend Andrew Breitbart used to say, and again, Andrew and I were close friends. I talked to him 3 hours before he passed away of a heart attack, by the way. And that's a story for another time, but he absolutely died of a heart attack. He'd been in the hospital a year before and blah, blah, blah. But Andrew always said that we on the new media have to be more scrupulous than the mainstream media. I know he felt strongly about that personally. And he hired me when I was writing for Huffington Post because he wanted somebody with a different ideological perspective than him, but who he'd seen my work on the John Edwards story and other stuff that I'd done. And he was like, hey, this guy's a truth teller. He sees Edwards as having an affair. He tells it. And I got kicked off Daily Cause for reporting it. I was right, and now everyone knows I was right. But I'd done that consistently throughout my 12-year career in journalism. And Andrew saw that and was like, I want to work with this guy. And that's why what these guys are doing is so disgusting to me, because what their philosophy is let's take the people who've been burned. I'll put it like this. These guys are the equivalent of someone who are trolling for runaways at a bus station. Right? If you go to a bus station, you'll find teary-eyed teenage girls getting off the bus. You may have to wait a little bit, but then you know how to exploit them. It's pretty easy to figure out how to pull those strings if someone's young and blah blah blah, and obviously going through emotional turmoil, and you know what's going on. And so you're in New York City, you watch the bus terminals, you go, that's the girl I need to grab. That's kind of what they did here. They knew, and again, this is not conjecture. When you read Jeff Giesia's paper that's up at NATO Stratcom, they know how to pull people's strings, and they pride themselves on it. The mistake that people made in the Trump camp was, I'll put it like this. It's like if you met a girl at a bar and you're like, I met a girl last night. She's great. Oh, what does she do? She's a con man. Well, what do you mean? Oh, no, she told me she does confidence games and stuff, and she steals guys' money. She gets them to date her, and then she takes their money. How was the date? It was fantastic. I'm seeing her again on Thursday. She wouldn't do that to me. And you just go like, well, she just told you her plan. So if you get robbed, and so these are people who tell you they're into Psy-Ops and manipulation and memes. And what the Trump supporters went is, hey, I know these guys are telling me they're going to lie, but they're wearing a Trump hat, so I guess that makes it okay.
And
I guess it's
Lee,
better.
I remember years ago, before the politicization and the weaponization of the newly awaked, we used to always hear about the work of Cass Sunstein and the fact that he talked about conspiracy and the infiltration of the conspiracy movement, cognitive infiltration, he would call it. We should have been expecting these wave of characters to come. They told us beforehand,
Yeah, well, and what I view, you got to understand, these people are also iterative. In other words, these are people with backgrounds in software, and that's the age we live in. And so in a world of software, you get out a version 1.0, you try it, you see what people like and don't like, then you do a version 2.0. The QAnon movement, in my opinion, was Pizzagate 2.0.
Absolutely.
Right? And I will tell you, this is personal experience. This is not, the source here is me. I never bought into I saw the Pizzagate thing right away. I said, this is cold reading, which is something magicians do. And I have friends who are magicians, and I used to be a magician. And cold reading is where you go, okay, Kev, I'm sensing, you've paid $20 to come to, I've got my crystal ball. And I go, okay, Kev, I'm sensing a sickness in your family. I'm getting a J, could be a John or maybe a Judy. And then suddenly you go, I got an Uncle Joe who just got diagnosed with cancer. I go, that's it. Now, that trick was, I never said, Uncle Joe, you filled it in. I said, I'm getting a J. There's lots of J names, and there's lots of diseases. Now you filled it in. So QAnon was doing that. They would throw out a bunch of vague whatever, and then later they'd go, aha, see, where I said, thanks, Kim, that was saying that there was a C, and it was like, they're cold reading. They're doing a trick. I view QAnon, they realize the problems with Pizzagate, which is, it could be used to discredit people, because guys like Cernovich and Posobiec, it embarrassed them. People have forgiven that stuff apparently, but they've forgiven them. And they were like, but let's not even do that. Let's make it completely anonymous. And both of these things, QAnon too, was dealing with pedophile rings, right? That was an undercurrent in QAnon that Trump, when the Great Awakening happens, is going to indict all these people. And none of those things have turned out to be true. But the QAnon movement, if you ask the cui bono question, as my friend George Galloway points out, and says much cooler, he's got like you, he's got a better accent than me. But the cui bono, I can't even do it. I can't even roll my R's the way Galloway does. But the cui bono, who benefits? Who benefits from this? It helps split the Trump base, because the people who are rational or more rational go, this QAnon thing is crazy. The people who are kind of rational and like to do research at a low level are having fun. The QAnon thing is almost a game. It's like, can we find the clues? They saw that when they did the WikiLeaks. The WikiLeaks drop showing those emails was, don't forget, the media, mainstream media, was ignoring it. And then Pizzagate derailed it. It suddenly turned people into clue hunters, right? They're trying to find, every day a new thing comes out and they're going to find a connection to pizza or hot dogs or something. But the who benefits is anybody who's facing pedophilia charges. Because again, now with QAnon 2, you've made the Trump base seem crazy and stupid. And one of the things that they're crazy and stupid about is these wild stories of elite pedophiles. Now, again, the people involved in this knew that these other cases against Epstein, the civil cases and the Florida criminal victims' rights case, were moving their way for the courts. Cernovich, who has become the spokesperson, the guy who's the hero of this story, never talks about the criminal rights case. He falsely claims that he was the first to file. Not true. Read the decision. Dershowitz was the first to file. He cuts Dershowitz out of the story at almost every turn. But it's not just, again, to me, it is not just an accident or ego. People, as I mentioned before we went to break there, I've got a nice little set here for my video because I worked in TV and I want things to look nice. Mike, who's got a lot of money behind him, and I'll mention the social media connection in one sec. Mike's got a lot of money behind him, in addition to having a lot of money on his own. People have told me close to him he's a millionaire, and I believe it because he's bragged about having a 7-figure payday. I believe that 7-figure payday was the day he divorced from his first wife. Mike Cernovich's first wife was one of the early people at Facebook. She was she was an attorney like him. They met at Pepperdine, and they divorced later. He had gone to Pepperdine, but had never got his law license. And she was literally, I've seen her LinkedIn resume. She's one of the early people. And I'm not going to name her because she doesn't have anything to do with this, but she's real. And I've seen the court filings. That's who I know who she is. So, but she was one of the first people at Facebook. She's currently at another major well-known startup. She's been at a few other ones. And so when they divorced, Mike collected alimony, and this has been written about before, a huge settlement from his wife, who had made a lot of money, and he'd never gotten his law license or practiced law. He'd gone to law school at Pepperdine, as I said, but he never got his law license. So he ended up making a huge amount of money. Now these are guys with a lot of money behind them, and don't forget, he was married to her at a time she was one of the early people in Facebook. So, that's one connection. And I mentioned Ali Alexander. Ali, again, he's a friend of mine. He's a guy I've known for a while. But Ali's connected with Jack Dorsey. Ali's connected with Jack Dorsey at Twitter. And I will note for the record that the platforms that, and by the way, Bilderberg, if you look on the current steering committees, Peter Thiel, who we mentioned, works at Jeff Thiel was behind Deplorable too. So Eric Schmidt's on there as well. Because again, these guys, Eric Schmidt, the big Hillary donor, Trump, the big Trump donor, right? Eric Schmidt. Oh, look, they're the same. They're sitting around figuring out what Bilderberg should do next in the steering committee, right? That's the way these guys operate. And so what happened was, notice who got taken off social media. Notice it was Alex Jones who got pulled off, got deplatformed in a big way by all these things. Now, again, Cernovich is why I assume that Cernovich knew, I mean, his wife certainly knew Jeff Zuckerberg. Absolutely, 100%. Mike, I don't hear him talk about that. I don't hear him talk about that aspect of his life. He doesn't talk much. He talks a little bit about his military background. and he graduated officers school. I don't know what happened after that. I'm going to put that out there too. That's an interesting connection. I don't know what it means, but he's got that background. But I don't hear him talk much, a little bit, about his wife. And if he knew Jeff Zuckerberg, I have not found it. Maybe it's out there and I've missed it. But I find that interesting in a dog that it didn't bark. But Ali's close to Jack Dorsey too, and talks about it openly. So you have people in this group connected to Jeff Gesia, connected to Mike Cernovich, connected to Jack Posobiec, connected to Ali Alexander, who have major social media connections. And look at who gets targeted and look at who gets platformed. Well, yes, Laura, some of it was, I think, organic. Some of it, I don't know about that.
And let's think about this as well, Lee. Sorry, but just before, we've got 4 minutes left, and this is, I think, really important too, to add to this. I said to you during one of the breaks that, Bannon had come across my radar lately when I watched The Great Hack, the Netflix documentary, and I'd been decoding and reviewing that documentary on the show the other night. And here's a guy that was the vice chairman of Cambridge Analytica, who had all these data points on all the American voters and knew exactly who was in that state of running away at the bus station, ready to be picked up by anyone after they had realized that the mainstream media's, lying to them. They don't know who to vote for. And then conveniently, you have all these characters coming along that push the same memes that Cambridge Analytica came up with. Right.
Yes. And again, the people, the base, the Trump base doesn't know any of this. They see, I've got my cute set here. Mike Cernovich, the millionaire, still does stuff up against the wall. It looks very like homespun. Mike has had an organization. His business partner, who I had no idea he had, introduced himself to me, talked to me for a half hour at CPAC because of something that happened there. And it's a long story, and we get like probably 2.5 minutes. But Mike has a whole organization behind him, and specifically Jeff Gesia. And again, there's not any question about that. Jeff made a speech at Deplorable. There's that article that you found. This is all out there. But again, did you find a Wikipedia for Jeff? I didn't. How does that guy not have a Wikipedia page? Again, I plan to go up to Wikipedia later and take care of that.
Like I say, it's the weirdest person I've ever Googled, because like you say, it was hard to find anything,
Yes. And the stuff you find, the good thing about that is the stuff you find is all very frightening.
And with all this connections into big tech, my speculation here, these are the kind of people that can pay for a search result to be skewed.
Well, I mentioned Khodorkovsky before. One of his partners, and this just shows you how these elites think. One of his partners started a company that edits Wikipedia, a major company that edits Wikipedia pages. That's all they do all day. His reputation. You know what I'm saying? These are people who understand how this stuff works and can pay for it. You see? And so, and all they know that if Cernovich places, what they do is 90% of the stuff they say is true or right. And so if you're running a con game, the best thing to do is tell the truth as much as possible. And then just lie in the 5 or 10% that you need to steal from the person. Does that make sense?
And as QAnon says, disinformation is necessary.
That's right. Yes. And once you set that up as a ground rule, then anything goes.
Lee, we're almost out of time, brother. Key points: Cernovich, fraud; Posobiec, fraud. Everyone to check out your work over on Periscope. If they can help you with the book, Stranahan.com. PayPal me / or is it paypalme.com/Lee Stranahan. Brother, I thank you for what you're doing. One of the most important broadcasts we've had on here in a long time, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be back tomorrow night, so wherever you are, make it TFR and check everything that we've said.